When Billie-Jo Jenkins joined a foster family in 1992, it should have marked the start of a bright and happy future. But just 5 years later, Billie-Jo would be dead, her life brought to a brutal end in her very own back garden. While some say she died at the hands of a stranger, some think the answer lies much closer to home. This is the Case Remains podcast, episode 5, The Unsolved Murder of Billie-Jo Jenkins. Billie-Jo Jenkins came into the world on the 29th of March 1983. Her parents, Debbie and Bill, had met under unconventional circumstances. In something of a prison double date, a friend whose partner was serving time in Wandsworth Prison asked Debbie to come along and visit his friend. It wasn't Bill's first stint in prison. He'd been convicted of a number of violent offences, including grievous bodily harm and assaulting a police officer. Nevertheless, Debbie and Bill hit it off, and the pair began to see each other once he was released. Debbie was later jailed as well, convicted of credit card fraud, and for a time Billie-Jo was looked after by her grandmother. As you can imagine, the unpredictable nature of Billie-Jo's upbringing soon started to affect her behaviour, and her primary school teachers started voicing concerns about her verbal and physical aggression at school. According to Debbie, when Billie-Jo was just 4, she nearly drowned the next-door neighbour by dunking his head into a bucket of water. Only 1 year later, she tried to attack a teenager with a potato peeler. When Debbie and Bill eventually split, Billie-Jo and her 2 siblings were put into care until Debbie could find them suitable accommodation. But when she found a 1-bedroom flat, the council told her that it was too small, and the children were sent to live with their Aunt Margaret. After a short spell, Margaret decided she couldn't look after all 3 children and agreed to take care of the youngest while Billie-Jo and her brother were sent to foster parents. After the first foster family didn't work out, the council made one last attempt to place them before they would be put into a children's home. In February of 1992, a woman named Lois Jenkins approached her husband, Sean, with an advert she'd seen in the local newspaper describing 2 children who were in need of a foster home. The pair already had 4 daughters together, but Lois's parents had fostered while she was growing up, and she liked the idea of doing it herself. So after a few weeks of interviews, Billie-Jo and her brother arrived in the Jenkins home. The matching surnames weren't the only coincidence. In fact, Billie-Jo was already friends with their daughter Annie, who was in the year below her at school. After just a few days, Billie-Jo's brother was removed from the Jenkins and taken to a children's home. It's not clear as to why this happened, although later reports suggest that he eventually ended up back with their mother, Debbie. When Billie-Jo came into their care, the Jenkins had already planned to move from their home in Newham, an East London borough, down to the seaside town of Hastings, about 70 miles or 113 kilometres away. With Billie-Jo's aunt and sister just round the corner from them in Newham, they weren't sure whether she'd want to make the move, particularly as she'd only been with them for a few weeks by that point. But when they asked, she was happy to go with them. In Sean's mind, she saw it as a chance to make a fresh start. So the family of 7 loaded up a van and arrived at their new home in Hastings on August 19th, 1992. The next few years passed pretty much without incident, or at least with nothing out of the ordinary for a family of growing girls. Billie-Jo settled in well at school and made good friends. She was on the school council, played on the hockey team, and developed a love for drama, deciding that she'd like to be an actress when she grew up. Sean got a job as the headmaster of a local boys' school, while Lois went back to work as a social worker. By all accounts, they were a normal, happy family. But all of that was about to change. February the 15th, 1997 was a Saturday, and a busy one for the Jenkins household. Billie-Jo had seen some trainers that she wanted in town, and Sean had told her that she could go and get them after she finished helping with some jobs around the house. One of Billie-Jo's sisters, Charlotte, went to the cinema with a friend and was due for a clarinet lesson that afternoon. Lois decided to take 2 of the other girls, Esther and Maya, into town, leaving Sean to pick up Charlotte after her lesson. Billie-Jo's other sister, Annie, had also been given some chores to do. Billie-Jo had been tasked with sweeping up twigs and leaves in the garden while Annie cleared out the utility room. During the clear-up, she left some items out on the coal bunker, including a set of large metal tent pegs. The patio doors also needed painting after an attempted break-in had left the wood damaged. The Jenkins lived next to a vacant house, and break-ins and prowlers were a common problem in the area, one that Lois and Sean had reported several times to the police. So Billie-Jo started painting the doors while Annie was out front washing the car. Before too long, it was time to go and collect Charlotte from her clarinet lesson. Annie wanted to go with Sean, but Billie-Jo decided she would rather stay at home and carry on with the painting, so Sean said that Annie would take over the job when they got back. It wasn't unusual for Billie-Jo to stay home alone when the family were just popping out for a short period of time, a fact that Annie confirmed in a later police interview. The pickup took a little longer than expected, as Sean hadn't realised that he was also supposed to drop Charlotte's friend home from the lesson. After coming back to the house, Sean realised that they had run out of white spirit, and so he decided to go to the nearby DIY store to get some more, so that Billie-Jo and Annie could finish painting the patio doors. So Charlotte quickly dropped off her clarinet into her bedroom, and her, Annie and Sean headed off to the shop. Now this is where Sean's version of events becomes a little strange. The Jenkins lived on Lower Street, which is directly opposite Alexandra Park. The most direct route to the DIY shop was to take a left on Lower Park Road until you reach the end of the park, then take a right to reach the main road, which would then lead you pretty much directly to the shop. Sean said that he always drove off in the direction the car was facing to avoid having to do a 3-point turn in the road, which was on a busy section on a bend. So instead of turning the car and just taking a left, he took a right down to the bottom of Alexandra Park. Sean then decided that it was too late for Annie to start painting, despite only having left the house a couple of minutes before, so drove all the way back around the park towards the house. According to Sean, he then realised that Annie was upset about not being able to paint, so instead of stopping back home, he drove past the house and around the park once again, before carrying on down the main road towards the shop. So rather than just take a left and driving in pretty much a straight line, Sean drove round the entire park twice. Once they reached the shop, then Sean realised he didn't even have any money on him, so he turned around in the shop's entrance and drove the girls back home. It was then that he and his young daughters discovered Billie-Jo.
Thank you. Go ahead, caller. Where do you need the ambulance?
48 Lower Park Road.
Lower Park Road.
Lower Park Road, Hastings, and it's an emergency.
And what's happened there?
I don't know. My daughter's fallen, or she's got head injuries. There's blood everywhere.
Well, she's banged her head and bleeding from the head.
Yes, well, I don't know. There's blood everywhere on her head. She's lying on the floor.
And can I take your name, sir?
Sean Jenkins.
13-year-old Billie-Jo was lying in front of the patio doors with her skull cracked open, a bloodied 18-inch, 1.5-pound tent peg next to her on the ground. Sean called their neighbour Denise, told her there had been an accident and asked her to come to the house straight away. Denise arrived and went into the playroom to comfort Annie and Charlotte, who were obviously very upset by what they had seen. Denise went back and forth between the girls and Billie-Jo, wrapping a towel around Billie-Jo's head to try and stem the flow of blood and cover her injuries. It was then she noticed that one end of the black bin bag that Billie-Jo had put on the ground to sit on had been stuffed deep into her left nostril. Sean, meanwhile, went outside to put the roof up on his car. When questioned about why he'd gone to do this while his foster daughter lay dying in their garden, Sean didn't really have an explanation. By the time an ambulance crew arrived, it was too late. Billie-Jo was gone. 24 hours after Billie-Jo was discovered, police conducted interviews with Sean as well as his two eldest daughters, Annie and Charlotte. Annie, who was aged 12 at the time, said that just before they left for the DIY shop, she had seen that the garden gate was closed, but that when they returned, the gate was open. She said that she'd noticed it because you could see a rabbit hutch through the gate, and the gate was pretty much always shut because they had a dog that they didn't want running out. Charlotte, then aged 10, also said that she and Billie-Jo had said hello to each other just before Sean took her and Annie to the shop. When asked about the order in which they'd left the house, she says that Annie was first and was already waiting by the car and that she followed, with Sean shutting the door behind them. When asked if there was any time in between her and Sean leaving the house, her reply was, "No, I came out and he came out just after me and then shut the door." When Annie is asked how long it was before Sean left the house, her reply is a few minutes, about 2 minutes, 1 minute. That was all police needed to strengthen their suspicions that Sean Jenkins could be guilty of murder. The next Wednesday, Lois and Shaw made a television appeal in the hopes of catching Billie-Jo's killer. Much has been made of this appeal in the years that have passed, with people saying that Sean comes across detached and unemotional. In fact, Lois would later say that it was after this appearance that she began to suspect that Sean may have been responsible for Billie-Jo's death.
As a family, we are totally devastated. We do not understand why our daughter has been murdered or what the motive could possibly be. We appeal to anyone who thinks they have any information about this crime to contact the police urgently.
Despite the police's suspicions of Sean, the early stages of the investigation were largely focused on a mysterious prowler with a scar on his face, who several people had reported seeing in the area. The national press had even caught on to it, running headlines such as "Find the Scarface Killer of Billie-Jo" and "Billie-Jo Murder, Hunt for Scarface." As more and more sightings of the man began to pour in, police soon identified the man as Mark Lynham, a 40-something-year-old with a history of mental illness. When police arrived at his house to arrest him, Lynham became violent, grabbing one of the attending officers by the throat. When he was taken to the station, police recovered several small pieces of plastic in his pockets. When checking on him in his cell, an officer also saw Lynham take a small bit of plastic from his shoe and hold it up to his face. Worried that he was about to swallow it, the officer went into his cell and took it from Lynham's hands. After strip searching him, they found another 2 pieces of plastic hidden in his underwear. A psychiatrist deemed him unfit to be interviewed, and Lynham was detained under the Mental Health Act and released into the care of a psychiatric unit. But police soon had another suspect on their radar, Sean and Lois's friend and neighbour, Felix Simmons. Lois and another neighbour, Peter, had both pointed the police towards Felix, mostly because of some erratic behaviour the year before, when sadly he'd suffered from a nervous breakdown. This included a kidnapping charge from where Felix took the neighbour Peter out in his car and drove him around for 4 hours. Following the incident, Felix was sectioned and released after a few days of care. When officers went round to Felix's house to talk to him about Billie-Jo, they saw specks of white paint on his clothing, the same colour that Billie-Jo had been using on the patio doors. Felix had been decorating the kitchen at the time, but he was using yellow paint, not white. That August, Felix was arrested on suspicion of murder, but the case against him soon fell apart. His wife was able to provide an alibi for him, and upon closer inspection it was discovered that the paint on his clothing was yellow after all. Suspicious of his account of that day, Sean was also arrested early on. A preliminary examination of his clothes revealed spots of Billie-Jo's blood, but the Crown prosecution deemed there was not enough evidence to charge him, and for the time being, Sean was allowed to go home. Lois, however, was already convinced of his guilt, and refused to let him come back to her and the children, even refusing to take his phone calls. With that, he caught a flight back to his hometown in Wales. After a couple of weeks, on March the 14th, Sean arranged a meeting with his daughters, but when he arrived, police arrested him once again. In between the first arrest and the second, Lois had made several statements to police suggesting that their children had said things that contradicted their original interviews, and also accused Sean of being violent towards her and their children. It was just what the police needed to finally make their move. Sean's bail was set at £100,000, which a number of his friends and family raised between them, and was allowed back to Wales after 2 weeks in prison. While he was awaiting trial, Lois asked him for a divorce, and after being adjourned in April, the murder trial finally began in June of 1998. After his arrest, police had carried out background checks on Sean and discovered that he had lied about his qualifications on his CV in order to strengthen his application as head teacher at the school. This was also brought up at the later trial and even earned Sean a charge of obtaining a pecuniary advantage by deception. It makes him a liar, sure, but it's not clear what part of embellishing your CV makes you more likely to be a murderer. After being approached by police, Dr. Arnon Bentovim, a child and adolescent psychiatrist, along with his wife Marianne, a family therapist, also produced a damning report on the Jenkins family. In it, they described Sean as a violent man who had an inappropriate relationship with his daughters, found Billie-Jo provocative and bought her age-inappropriate clothing. The report even accused him of having an affair with a 17-year-old girl, an accusation which doesn't seem to have any evidence behind it. Though their report was never submitted as evidence, it was referenced during the judge's rulings, and the police had also relied on the Bentovim's advice throughout the whole process. At trial, the prosecution argued that Sean had killed Billie-Jo in a fit of rage before concocting the need for a trip to the DIY store in an attempt to come up with an alibi. A search of the house had revealed that the Jenkins already had a bottle of white spirit sitting in their cupboard. The strange route and the fact that he didn't take any money with him only helped solidify their version of events. Annie and Charlotte's interviews, which would normally have been included automatically, were not allowed to be used as evidence because Lois had made several statements saying that their evidence had changed. There were also a number of inconsistencies in the information that Sean gave the emergency services. During the 999 call, he said he'd been gone for about half an hour or 45 minutes, when the trip to the shop could only have taken around 10. He also told the operator that he had turned Billie-Jo on her side, when in fact he'd done nothing of the sort. A key part of the evidence against Sean was the 158 microscopic blood spots found on his trousers, his fleece jacket, and his shoe. The spots were approximately the same size as those on Billie-Jo's leggings. Yet neither Denise, the neighbour who'd immediately come to the scene, nor the attending paramedics had any blood on their clothes. If the blood had come from him holding Billy, for example, it would have been in a large patch rather than in hundreds of microscopic spots. The forensic scientists presenting the evidence concluded that there was only one answer, that Sean had been the person who'd murdered Billie-Jo. On July 2nd, 1998, Sean was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. While Sean was incarcerated, a television program called Trial and Error made an episode about the case, suggesting that maybe a miscarriage of justice had taken place. Lois made an official complaint to television bosses and tried to block the program from being shown, saying that it would distress her and Sean's children. As a result, the show was postponed, although it did eventually make it on air in September, 1 month after their divorce was finalised. In the show, Professor David Dennison had cast doubt on the trial's key evidence, the microscopic blood spots, stating that Billie-Jo's airways would have been full of blood, and as a result she could easily have breathed out the kind of spray that was found on Sean's clothes. Public interest in the case was reignited, and 2 months later, Sean was granted leave for appeal. During the appeal, however, the prosecution stated that there was no evidence of any type of blockage that the new medical testimony had suggested. On top of the medical evidence, Sean's legal team also argued that there had been an abusive process in the original investigation, and that police had sought to persuade Lois and the children of Sean's guilt right from the very start. The appeal judges didn't buy it, however, and the appeal was denied in December of 1999. Sean and his lawyer decided to start putting together a case for the Criminal Cases Review Commission, or CCRC, which is England's statutory body which is responsible for investigating miscarriages of justice. They decided they needed one thing that had been missing from the original trial. They needed Charlotte and Annie to give evidence. But with Sean and Lois's relationship in tatters by this point, getting the girls to testify was no easy feat. By then, Lois had also met a new partner and announced her plans to move to Tasmania with him and take all 4 daughters with her. After a bit of legal back and forth, with Lois not wanting the girls to give evidence at the appeal, it was eventually decided to ask Annie and Charlotte themselves. Both of them agreed, and Sean's second appeal began on the 30th of June 2004, 4 years after the first appeal had been denied. As well as again debating the scientific evidence on which Sean had been found guilty, The CCRC also steered attention back towards Mark Lynham, the mentally ill man who had been arrested back in 1997, and made the connection between his apparent fixation with plastic bags and the fact that part of a bin bag had been shoved up Billie-Jo's nose. They also argued that the original jury had been led to believe that the defence could have called Sean's daughters as defence witnesses, but had chosen not to, when in actuality they weren't allowed to be called in the first place. In the end, it was only Charlotte who flew over to give evidence for the defence, as the timing interfered with Annie's exams. Lois, too, came to give evidence, although hers was given as part of the prosecution. It was testimony from Professor Andrew Nicholson, however, that finally sealed Sean's fate. An examination of samples from Billie-Jo's lungs determined that she had pulmonary interstitial emphysema, or PIE. In simple terms, he found a tear in her lung that is caused only when a person's airways are blocked, which could quite easily cause the kind of blood spray that was found on Sean's clothes. Sean's murder conviction was quashed, and a retrial of the case was scheduled for April 2005, 7 years after he was originally convicted. There it was decided once and for all that Sean Jenkins was an innocent man. But not everyone was convinced. As Sean sat outside the courtroom, finally free, Billie-Jo's aunts Margaret and Bev came up to him and began to punch and kick him, even drawing blood. Later, Sean was denied when he attempted to get £500,000 for his time spent in prison. Rules state that applicants must show they are clearly innocent if they are to receive any compensation money. As for who did kill Billie-Jo Jenkins, well, there's only one person who can ever know for sure. Thank you for listening to episode 5 of the Case Remains podcast. If you'd like to keep in touch, you can find us on Twitter and Instagram with the handle Case Remains, or you can visit our website www.caseremains.com, where you'll find write-ups of missing persons cases and unsolved mysteries. If you are enjoying the podcast, please do take a moment to leave us a rating or a review on iTunes, as it helps others to find the show. Until next time, stay safe.